It's time to revisit the SpaceX Starship again. We haven't done so in a while, and there has been a lot going on. But in this video, we don't want to only focus on Starship, but on the competition. Is there actually even a real competitor in the works? Will there ever be a Starship killer? We see more and more renderings or designs that look surprisingly similar to Starship. So let's in this video analyze all the competition to our favorite launch system and categorize it by capability, and then ultimately come to the conclusion if there ever will be something so much as a Starship killer. Let's first start with an overview of where SpaceX currently is regarding their overall Starship program and how far they actually are with their preparations for orbital Starship flights. In Boca Chica itself, where SpaceX is building their whole Starship facility and the Starships themselves, we have the orbital launch tower being built, the one that is going to catch the Super Heavy boosters as they will land. Incredibly, Elon Musk came forth with this idea at some point, and while everyone was thinking,
well, you know something, man, you wanna know what I think? I think this is a crackpot idea. That's what I think. How about that? How about a little of that? I think it's a crackpot idea.
it looks more and more as if SpaceX is actually really gonna do it. So the Super Heavy booster is the giant booster that will launch Starship into orbit, with a thrust of about 72 meganewtons and the capacity to lift more than 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit. Even more than 100 metric tons to the Moon with orbital refueling, and even that same number to Mars, which is far beyond anything other rocket systems nowadays are even remotely capable of. Then SpaceX has bought 2 oil rigs back in January and named them Deimos and Phobos, like the moons of Mars. They are in the process of being transformed into floating launch and landing platforms for Starship and Super Heavy launches from sea. With Starship SN16 being retired before it even flew, which we find weird, but hey, who are we to question Elon's decisions? SpaceX is now focusing entirely on the development of the orbital Starships. The first Super Heavy booster, BN1, is fully stacked and ready, but it's only a production pathfinder. The BN2 will be the first booster to really fly. According to Elon, the first flight might happen as early as this summer, but come on, we know Elon time by now, right? I would guess that if SpaceX will manage to launch the first Super Heavy Plus Starship late this year or early next year, we can be all very happy and celebrate. But why do we tell you about Starship? Why is the whole space community so obsessed with Starship? Well, because it will be the most transformative vehicle for spaceflight ever. It will be extremely powerful, more powerful than any other rocket in existence today, and at the same time it will be fully reusable, thus bringing down costs for accessibility to space by many orders of magnitude. This way, it will enable us to build bases on the Moon much cheaper than we could have ever done with conventional, non-reusable rockets. And this way we can even fly to Mars and build Mars bases, because with non-reusable rockets this would have always remained a dream, as costs just were much too high. So this is the reason why so many awesome space channels like What About It or Marcus House entirely focus on Starship. Not because we are all Elon fanboys, but because this rocket is really absolutely transformative. But what is the competition doing meanwhile? Is anyone actually trying to build their own Starship? Does anyone have a rocket that comes even close to the capabilities of Starship? Will there ever be a Starship killer? The pun with the Tesla killer is, by the way, 100% intended. Because exactly as with the Tesla killer, we shall see that here too the competition doesn't seem to be able to copy Elon Musk. Let's start with China. China's currently most powerful rocket is the Long March 5B rocket, with a LEO payload capability of 25 metric tons. This means only 8 to 9 metric tons to the Moon and only 6 metric tons to Mars. Also, this rocket is an old school rocket which is entirely non-reusable. Compare this with Starship's 100 plus metric tons to LEO, Moon and Mars and full reusability, and you quickly understand that this rocket is nowhere near Starship's capability. But China has some smaller startups working on their own reusable rockets. So do they have something in the works even remotely as powerful as Starship? Nope. In fact, they still are in the early experimental stages, like SpaceX was about 10 years ago. iSpace and LinkSpace are two such Chinese startups, and they both work on some rockets, but those rockets will be a lot weaker than even Falcon 9. Then the reusable version of Long March 8, on which China is also working, it will be also absolutely nowhere nearly as powerful as Starship, with only about 4.5 metric tons of payload to low Earth orbit. But not long ago, this video here was released by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology. Eric Berger uploaded this onto his channel, and what we can see here is quite astonishing. An animation of a vehicle that looks really remarkably like Starship. It's hilarious how they even copied the style of the animation itself. That's like really some thorough copying here. So anyways, it seems that some officials in China are already thinking of building their own Starship. Interestingly, the Starship copy here is only shown for Earth-to-Earth transport, but not for deep space applications such as to the Moon or Mars. But let's keep this in mind. Even if they started work on Starship right now, SpaceX already has such a gigantic lead that it is extremely unlikely that China will have their copycat Starship before 2030. I would go even further and say that China will not have reusable rockets of the Starship class before 2035, because we see that they are even now unable to produce their own version of Falcon 9, let alone Falcon Heavy. Of course, they have their Long March 9 heavy lift rocket, which will be as capable as Starship, but purely with regard to launch capability to low Earth orbit. But it will be non-reusable and won't support orbital refueling, so that it will not be able to send more than 100 metric tons to the Moon or to Mars like Starship, nowhere near that number. And while editing this video here, naively thinking that this time no news would pop up, thus disrupting my workflow, what happens? Of course some new info pops up that China might be copying the Super Heavy booster. Yes, indeed. On a space conference on Thursday the 24th in Hong Kong, during a presentation about future Chinese space plans, this slide here was shown. And what is interesting is that here suddenly the Changzheng 9, that is the Long March 9, is suddenly shown with a completely new engine arrangement, namely 16 YF-135 engines, instead of the old layout with far fewer but larger engines, and no side boosters. It would have a LEO capacity of 150 metric tons as shown in the slide. Interesting, highly interesting. So it seems that China is really seriously starting to ditch their old designs more and more in favor of Starship and Super Heavy designs. But still, even so, this will require a complete redesign of the Long March 9, and we assume that this Chinese Super Heavy rocket will not see the light of day before 2030, best case. So we see that China is very far behind SpaceX, and they will not have their own Starship anytime soon. Not long ago, the quite young startup Relativity Space, founded 6 years ago by former Blue Origin employees, we wonder why they left Blue Origin, revealed this interesting animation of their Terran R rocket. This rocket looks remarkably similar to Starship and Super Heavy. Like really remarkably similar. It's so funny that all these companies never acknowledge by whom they were inspired. I mean, if I ever have a rocket company, which won't happen, but if I had, I would say, look at our new rocket, it's 100% copied from SpaceX. But hey, that's just me. Anyways, it is fully reusable like Starship, but won't be nearly as capable with only 20 metric tons of launch capacity to low Earth orbit, which is a maximum of only 20% of Starship. Also, nothing is said about orbital refueling. However, they say that it's going to be built fully from 3D printed parts, which is of course quite interesting. And Relativity Space also says that it will launch in 2024, which, let's be realistic, is absolutely almost impossible, because rocket development timelines are always very prone to long delays. We will believe it when we see it. Speaking of delays, we now come to the masters of delays, namely ULA, Blue Origin, and NASA themselves. Let's start with ULA. They currently are still using their Delta IV Heavy rocket, which is basically a non-reusable and weaker version of the Falcon Heavy. It can launch 28.8 metric tons to LEO, so less than half of Falcon Heavy's 65 metric tons, and let's not even talk about Starship's 100 plus metric tons. Of course, ULA has been saying since years now that their Vulcan Centaur rocket will soon be ready and will launch next year. It started development in 2014 when they entered a partnership with Blue Origin, and back then they expected Vulcan Centaur to fly no earlier than 2019. No earlier is quite funny, as the year 5855 would also qualify as no earlier than 2019. Anyways, joking aside, the rocket is now planned to be ready in the next 2 to 3 years, and we'd say that 2023 might be a somewhat realistic launch date. It will be only partially reusable, and by partially we mean minimum partially, as only the engines will be harvested and reused according to current plans. But the LEO payload capacity will still be only comparable to Delta IV Heavy, with only 27.2 metric tons to LEO. At least it will employ some form of orbital refueling, so this is already a step into the right direction. Also, please keep in mind that by 2023, Starship and Super Heavy might actually already be flying. And if that happens, then this rocket here is DOA. Speaking of DOA, which other rocket will be DOA if Starship manages to fly to orbit soon? Exactly, this wonderful vaporware rocket here called New Glenn. We have been shown animations of New Glenn now since many years, and back then we were absolutely incredulous at how some channels were seriously suggesting that New Glenn would be flying by 2021. We always said no chance before 2023, and this is a best case estimate. And lo and behold, in February this year, Blue Origin announced that indeed the rocket was postponed to late 2022, which is rocket company talk for some time in 2023. And this rocket too will be less capable than the Falcon Heavy, so here too we don't even have to compare it with Starship. At least this rocket is the first one that gets a bit closer to Falcon Heavy. That is at least something, with 45 metric tons to LEO. But this is still not even half of Starship, and it will also be only partially reusable, comparable to Falcon Heavy or Falcon 9. So not fully reusable such as Starship. And of course it also won't have orbital refueling. And speaking of Falcon Heavy, you have certainly often noticed the awesome models of Falcon Heavy and Falcon 9 in the background in our videos. This model here, the King, the one and only Falcon Heavy, is quite spectacular, and it is from the awesome company Bohemzo. They are 3D printing these models, and you can order them from their Etsy store site, the link of which we of course put into the description. The detail they put into their models is extraordinary. This Falcon Heavy model, for example, is very accurate, as you can see here, and it is an impressive 48 centimeters tall. For our Imperial unit loving friends, this is 18.9 inches. But they don't only have SpaceX models such as Falcon Heavy or Starship or Dragon. No, they also have many other cool sci-fi models, for example the USS Sulaco from Aliens. Come on, how can you not love the Sulaco? It was designed by Sid Mead, for God's sake. Or for example the Razor Crest from The Mandalorian. But many more. So please go and check out their site and maybe you will find something which you like. So back to the main topic. The undisputed king of delays is of course the famous Space Launch System, NASA's last own rocket we dare to predict, and one that will utterly fail as it is basically really just a lazy rehash of the Saturn V. Actually, it's worse than the Saturn V. You might actually call the SLS the Star Wars Episode 7 of rockets. A lazy copy worse than the original. Okay, we are a bit too harsh again, and we do apologize. It is in fact not a bad rocket in itself. It's just 20 years too late. If NASA would have built something like this in the 90s and launched missions to the moon in the 2000s, we would have been super hyped. But now with Starship on the horizon, how does SLS compare? Well, first of all, the development costs until now are closing in on the $20 billion mark. And it is already 4 years over time when it will launch in November this year on its maiden flight. It will be able to lift 95 metric tons to LEO in its Block 1 configuration and even 130 metric tons in its Block 2 configuration. But the more powerful configuration won't be ready for quite a few more years, if ever. So power-wise, this is actually on the same level as Starship and Super Heavy. But of course, contrary to Starship and Super Heavy, it is not reusable and thus will be completely thrown away every time after launch. That's why one SLS costs $1 billion, compared to Starship that will cost about $2 million per launch. Also, it has no orbital refueling of course, so no 100 metric tons to the moon or Mars, no, far less of course. Even the most powerful, the Block 2 cargo configuration, will only be able to send 46 metric tons to translunar injection orbit, so not even half of Starship. As we said, that rocket would have been nice as a Saturn V alternative in the 90s, but now it's just too late. It too is DOA when Starship will start flying regularly. But we are not done yet, because we also have the Europeans, and as we know the Europeans, they can do pretty cool stuff, but unfortunately they never think as big as the Americans and also are always severely slowed down by the bureaucratic monster that is the European Union. So if you think that NASA is slow, look no further than ESA. The Ariane 6 rocket will be the next European rocket and it is so DOA. It is the mother of all DOAs. It's been in development since 6 years now and the launch is expected earliest in late 2022, so let's be realistic, more like mid to late 2023. And then it will only have a LEO capability of 21.6 metric tons. Well, at least they are trying to copy SpaceX now, because funny enough, they now realize that SpaceX is completely and utterly destroying their entire launch business, so they now want to also build a reusable rocket ASAP. Enter the Themis project. This will be Europe's first reusable rocket, probably only partially reusable, so only the first stage, as for example the Falcon 9. It will be powered by the new Prometheus engine, which will create almost 1 meganewton of thrust. As the Raptor engine, it will also employ liquid methane and oxygen and will be reusable, but currently only up to 5 times. Themis is expected to fly no earlier than 2025. Yes, 2025. So this is so hilariously late that we wonder how it will feel for ESA to have the first maiden flight of their new rocket when Starship will have already possibly landed cargo on the moon and might be possibly already en route to Mars. But let's not be too harsh with the poor Europeans, because I am also from Europe and believe me, as a European, I feel real pain watching what Europe is doing in almost every regard, not only rockets. But we still have someone missing. Who might that be? Of course, the Russians. The Russians are currently still using their Soyuz rockets from back in the 60s, but in the last years they also started feeling the pain induced by SpaceX. SpaceX really completely destroyed their entire satellite launch business, which made Dmitry Rogozin, the chief of Roscosmos, famously attack SpaceX and Elon Musk on many occasions. For example, once he was accusing SpaceX of being subsidized by the US government, being the reason why they supposedly can offer such low prices. Of course, this has nothing to do with reusability, right? That's why suddenly, not long ago, renders of a new rocket called Amur started circulating. This rocket will be basically a weaker version of the Falcon 9 rocket, with only 10.5 metric tons to LEO in reusable mode and 13.6 in expandable configuration. Falcon 9 as a comparison launches 15.6 metric tons to LEO in reusable mode or 22.8 metric tons in expandable mode. The Amur rocket will be ready by 2024 earliest, but we assume it might be 2025 or even later. But we have to give them this, at least they are going reusable. Funny how SpaceX is making all rocket companies or organizations go fully reusable, the same way Tesla forced all car makers to start building electric vehicles. And now they all pretend it was the most obvious thing ever, right? Without Tesla and SpaceX, those assholes would still be building gasoline cars and non-reusable rockets, respectively, probably for many more decades. Sorry for the short outburst, this might happen sometimes on this channel. So anyways, Russia is also working on their Angara rocket family, and their largest Angara 5 can deliver 24.5 metric tons to LEO. It is speculated that an even larger Angara 7 might be built one day with 50 metric tons to LEO, but this one is at least 10 years away. And of course, the Angara rockets will be non-reusable. So you see, it is quite funny how no one else is able to build something even remotely as capable as what SpaceX is building with Starship and Super Heavy. All these other rockets, be it current or future rockets, are not anywhere as capable and transformative as Starship. That is why, exactly as with Tesla, where we are still waiting for the famous Tesla killers that never came but were proclaimed by idiotic mainstream media outlets probably 10 million times, the same will be true for Starship. It will be a very long time until other companies or nations might build a Starship-like vehicle with similar capabilities as the current Starship. We assume it will be China that will build the first Starship copy, but it most likely won't be ready before the 2030s. And keep in mind that until then, SpaceX will probably be already using the even larger, even more powerful Starship 2.0 with possibly 200 metric tons to LEO. Or maybe it will already be assembled entirely in space. Who knows what insane ideas Elon Musk will have until that time. By that time, we will very likely have moon bases and at least a base on Mars, for God's sake. And only then will others be able to copy Starship? But hey, we shouldn't complain, because as we saw, they at least start to copy SpaceX. And that is already a very good development. Because exactly as in the case with car makers and electric cars, this too will have a profound and transformative effect on humanity and will enable us to routinely fly to anywhere on Earth in under 1 hour, and also to routinely travel to the Moon and further in the future, even Mars. So the fact that there is no Starship killer yet, but many small mini wannabe Starship killers, is a really good thing for humanity as a species. Thanks for watching this video. Jishwan and me hope you enjoyed it, and the next episode will be again an episode together with Jishwan, or at the latest the one after the next. In that episode, we are going to revisit the idea of sending huge boring machines to the moon, and we are looking forward to cooperate with our friend Will from the awesome channel A Boring Revolution on this topic. So then, we wish you all the best and on to the future.